Hello, my name is Kim Wahnke, and this is my Visualizing Peace Learning Journey presentation on how we can spread peaceful messages. I started off the semester after having done my last year's research project on fairy tales and their potential to influence our narratives. I therefore had a very positive outlook on the potential of storytelling for narrative change. I engaged more with the topics of peace through narrative, as well as interpersonal peace and group interaction in week 3 and week 5 of this year's VIP, with the sessions focused on social psychology and narrative/music. What stood out in these sessions and in my readings was the immense power of interpersonal and oral storytelling for peaceful messages. How to harness this benefits as much as possible was something that emerged as an interest for me. First, one key reflection was that most of the VIP project resources are online, and a lot of them are also textual, and we can think about how we can get messages of peace across as authentically as possible, given that these are not personal resources. Thinking about my own project also connected to this, since I'm aiming to write a useful fiction fairy tale. Fairy tales are usually read out and therefore have that element of interpersonal connection more than a textual source, but it is unclear whether the resource will actually end up being read out loud. To look further into this issue, I've conducted interdisciplinary research, finding a variety of disciplines that touch upon this issue. Firstly, thinking about how to bridge the gap between in-person and textual communication for peace. This issue has been brought up in a variety of disciplines, including psychology, communication, education, literature, and marketing, to name a few. Focusing specifically on how to spread messages of peace were disciplines like international relations, sustainable development, peace education, and social anthropology. Furthermore, even non-academic sources heavily engage with this topic, like useful fiction work and publications of NGOs and charities. A lot of the publications express that without meeting people of a different group, it is much easier to create and uphold a negative perspective on them. Especially when you're part of a different group, stereotypes towards others tend to be reproduced in conversations and stories within a community. In order to meaningfully engage with a member of a different community and disrupt negative stereotypes, it is usually not enough for a third party, like a teacher or a text, to convince you to view them peacefully. Instead, this shift usually happens when interacting with other people in person. Peaceful messages are therefore easier transmitted through in-person interactions. The question then becomes how we can use the positive aspects of in-person storytelling without having the direct human interconnection through, for example, textual resources. Here's more of a visual representation of the communication of peaceful messages through in-person or textual storytelling. Some of the barriers of the latter include lack of the psychological power of human-on-human interaction, less accessible, less personal, and a text being much less of a personal learning experience, therefore also often being less engaging. The question then becomes how we can then minimize the negative effects that such a distance of textual resources creates. The first potential solution, or at least improvement, can be achieved through reverberating the message of peace. This can be done through a combination of the following: making the piece as engaging as relatable as possible, and focusing on the goal of portraying of shared humanity and empathy. Second would be an awareness of and engagement with all of the personal realms that storytelling operates on. This includes levels of knowledge, identity, socialization, emotions, morality, time, memory, and geographical space. Similarly, the story, if set in the real world, should acknowledge ideological, economic, and political power constraints. Finally, it should aim at portraying potential solutions and potential peace. By not presenting war and conflict as the default or as the natural order, the story then has the potential to generate discursive resources for peacemaking. The other potential solution centers on breaking down barriers, making resources as personal as possible, even in the light of an absence of actual in-person interaction. Here, impactful approaches include letting people tell their own story, which means actively engaging with and letting communities speak for themselves. A second step would be to make even textual resources as accessible as possible, for example, through the use of simple language, pictures, or text-to-speech tools. This includes the use of visuals, videos, and audios to make the resource more engaging. Furthermore, just like one would engage with in-person storytelling, it is important to get an introduction and some information on the storyteller in order to connect to them in textual resources too. Lastly, mirroring in-person engagement, textual storytelling should aim to make way for dialogue and conversation. This includes providing an opportunity to get in touch, ask questions, or provide feedback. I then reflected on how I can apply this to my own project and make my piece of useful fiction as engaging as possible. First, Using the reverberating the message approach, I plan to not portray actual living communities, since I do not have the time and resources for an actually meaningful engagement with them. I plan to make the content relatable for a wide range of audiences, therefore keeping content to widely shared experiences and keeping language simple. Even though fairy tales traditionally operate within a good-evil dichotomy, I instead aim to introduce morally gray characters and primarily focus on empathy and communication within the story. I think another important step for me is that if systems of oppression and inequality are portrayed, which I'm not sure if I will do yet, clearly labeling them as such is important instead of painting them as part of a natural order. Finally, portraying a realistic effort and a potential for peace is important. In terms of breaking down barriers, I'm thinking about making my piece in multiple versions. This could include other languages or an audio-only version. I think it is important to give people the opportunity to reach out after engaging with the story, which is why I'm thinking of giving people a way of getting in touch with me or the project after reading the story. To make people engage further with the story, I think that providing some reflective questions to think about would be very helpful and engaging. Lastly, even though this is very uncommon for fairy tale stories, I have reflected on adding an introduction for some of the main characters, allowing readers to connect with them and allowing for less of a good-evil dichotomy. Lastly, I reflected on the insights about peace that this research has allowed me to gain. This was that the personal dimension and human connection required for impactful storytelling and peace building is much more important than initially assumed by me. Furthermore, I believe that written narrative cannot be a full substitute for intercultural and interpersonal interaction. There can be quite a big gap between learning about people and their perspectives and actually interacting with them and hearing their thoughts. This means that in order to close this gap as much as possible, we should aim to model textual sources as close to interpersonal interactions as possible. Lastly, I also had to think about how these insights can be applied to the Visualizing Peace project. First, I believe that the project already does quite a good job at fostering in-person interaction through inviting expert guests and organizing in-person events. A lot of the sources also do a very good job at trying to bridge the gap. For example, the transcribed version of podcast episodes, the pictures and videos in museum entries, or this segment, including video presentations. A few suggestions that I have when reflecting on this further was both videoing VIP events, with consent of the participants, of course, as well as introducing tools like a text-to-speech or a dyslexic font for more text-heavy sources like the Visualizing Peace library. Lastly, one can have a think about the fact that most of the Visualizing Peace resources are online, and whether it would be possible to introduce a paper-based output, for example, publishing this in the St. Andrews library. This concludes my presentation and reflections. Thank you very much for listening. Here are my sources used for this presentation. If you'd like a further read on this topic,